Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. I want to ask people to please share this link from whatever platform you're listening to it on, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Anchor, YouTube, Facebook. Share this link. And if you have not listened to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily, once this episode is over, please go listen to those previous episodes. And if by the time you listen to this, there are future episodes out, please go listen to the future episodes. We are about a little more than 2/3 of the way through Evicted by Matthew Desmond. This has been a very enlightening book in informing us about the experience of people at the margins of housing and some of the issues that exist within housing. Okay. Chapter 19 is entitled Little. The cheapest motel Pam could find charged $50 a night. They checked in and started calling friends and relatives, hoping someone would take them in. 2 days passed without any luck, and Pam began to worry. Quote, "Everybody we knew weren't answering our phone because they knew we needed a place to stay," end quote, she said. Then Ned lost his part-time construction job. He was fired for the 2 days of work he missed when helping his family move from the trailer park. Job loss could lead to eviction, but the reverse was also true. An eviction not only consumed renters' time, causing them to miss work, it also weighed heavily on their minds, often triggering mistakes on the job. It overwhelmed workers with stress, leading them to act unprofessionally, and commonly resulted in their relocating farther away from their work site, increasing their likelihood of being late or missing days. Ned's firing wasn't out of the ordinary, but that was little consolation for Pam. Their money was running out. Even so, Ned refused to call his family. Typical, thought Pam. Ned called home to brag, but rarely to ask. So Pam worked her phone, calling almost everyone she knew, and even churches. Nothing. Finally, a friend agreed to take the girls until Pam and Ned got back on their feet. They dropped off the 3 oldest girls and kept 2-year-old Kristen with them. Then Ned's phone rang about 10 p.m. It was Travis, a buddy they used to party with in the trailer park who had since moved into a nearby apartment complex. Travis offered his couch. Pam breathed a sigh of relief. At least she wouldn't have to bring her new baby back to a cheap motel. Travis was their first godsend. Durkee was their second. A muscular, white-haired man with a professional-grade mechanic shop in his garage, Durkee gave Ned an off-the-books job customizing motorcycles. Ned had met him through a mechanic buddy. After a month at Travis's, Pam and Ned sensed he was about done with them. When Kristen got fussy, Travis would tighten his jaw and shut his bedroom door, and not only because he had to be up at 4:30 the next morning for work. The last time Travis let someone stay with him, it was his brother and nephew, and those 2 drunks got him evicted. Ned would tell Pam to hush her kid, and Pam would tell him that she was his goddamn kid too. One morning, they drove to Durkee's garage. Kristen and her Care Bear buckled up in the back seat. Pam was due in 9 days. They were no closer to a new home than they were the day Tobin kicked them out of the trailer park. They might have to live on the near south side with the Mexicans. Ned was out of cigarettes because Pam was smoking more to offset stress and hunger pains. Kristen was throwing a fit because her lovely Teddy got thrown in storage after the eviction. Durkee wanted Ned to do a transmission, which would probably mean working deep into the night, and he hated that his family had to rely on Travis. When he turned toward the booming music and saw a car with 2 young black men in the lane next to him, he hated them too. Quote, "Fucking niggers," end quote, Ned bit. A few minutes later, Ned spotted a rent sign in white, working class West Alleys, and told Pam to write down the phone number. She missed it. Quote, "I told you," end quote, Ned said. Quote, "I told you the fucking number and you just can't write it down," end quote. Quote, "Not when you say it so fast," end quote. Quote, "I'm not the one with the fucking problem," end quote. They circled back and got the number. Quote, "Hi, I was calling about your place on 76th in Lincoln. What's that, a 2-bedroom? End quote. Quote, "Yep," end quote, a man's voice said. Quote, "It's $695 a month with heat," end quote. Pam didn't hang up. Maybe he was flexible. Quote, okay, when is it available? End quote. Quote, now. End quote. Quote, it is? Okay. End quote. Quote, and who would you be living with? End quote. Quote, my family. I've got 3 children and 1 on the way, but they're all girls. End quote. Pam said, Pam said, quote, oh, no, no, no. We're trying to keep all of it only adults. End quote. Quote, oh, okay. Thank you. End quote. Pam brought the phone down. Quote, they don't want kids. End quote. Ned was wearing a black Ozzy Osbourne cut-off t-shirt and a Harley Davidson cap turned backward. He whistled through his teeth. Quote, I know. As soon as you say you've got 4 fucking kids, we're fucked. End quote. Pam knew it didn't even take that. When house hunting a few days earlier, 2 landlords had turned her away on account of her kids. One had said, quote, we're pretty strict here. We don't allow no loud nothing, end quote. The other had told Pam it was against the law for him to put so many children in a 2-bedroom apartment, which was the most Pam and Ned could afford. When talking to landlords, Pam had begun subtracting children from her family. She was beginning to wonder what was most responsible for keeping them homeless. Her drug conviction from several years back, the fact that Ned was on the run and had no proof of income, their eviction record, their poverty, or their children. Children caused landlords headache. Fearing street violence, many parents in crime-ridden neighborhoods kept their children locked inside. Children cooped up in small apartments used the curtains for superhero capes, flushed toys down the toilet, and drove up the water bill. They could test positive for lead poisoning, which could bring a pricey abatement order. They could come under the supervision of Child Protective Services, whose caseworkers inspected families' apartments for unsanitary or dangerous code violations. Teenagers could attract the attention of the police. It was an old tradition. Landlords borrowing children from their properties. In the competitive post-war housing market of the late 1940s, landlords regularly turned away families with children and evicted tenants who got pregnant. This was evident in letters mothers wrote when applying for public housing. Quote, at present, end quote, one wrote, quote, I am living in an unheated attic room with a 1-year-old baby. Everywhere I go, the landlords don't want children. I also have a 10-year-old boy. I can't keep him with me because the landlady objects to children. Is there any way that you can help me get an unfurnished room, apartment, or even an old barn? I can't go on living like this because I am on the verge of doing something desperate, end quote. Another mother wrote, quote, my children are now sick and losing weight. I have tried, begged, and pleaded for a place, but it's always too late or sorry, no children, end quote. Another wrote, quote, the lady where I am rooming put 2 of my children out about 3 weeks ago and don't want me to let them come back. If I could get a garage, I would take it, end quote. When Congress passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, it did not consider families with children a protected class, allowing landlords to continue openly turning them away or evicting them. Some placed costly restrictions on large families, charging, quote, children damage deposits, end quote, in addition to standard rental fees. One Washington, D.C. development required tenants with no children to put down a $150 security deposit, but charged families with children a $450 deposit plus a monthly subcharge of $50 per child. In 1980, HUD commissioned a nationwide study to assess the magnitude of the problem and found that only 1 in 4 rental units was available to families without restrictions. 8 years later, Congress finally outlawed housing discrimination against children and families, but as Pam found out, the practice remained widespread. Families with children were turned away in as many as 7 in 10 housing searches. Ned got out of the car and gave Kristen the rest of his McDonald's breakfast sandwich. Quote, give daddy a kiss. I'll be working. Love you, end quote. He kissed Pam too. Pam put her hand to her forehead. Quote, I'm ready to pop, end quote. Quote, Mama, playground, play, end quote, Kristen asked from the back seat. Quote, no, Kristen. Mama's busy looking for a place for us to live, end quote. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, so let's have a short reflection. So, what stands out to me from the passages that we just read is the is again just the people who are on the margins and who are vulnerable, who are the most on who are the on the most of the margins, or who are the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, exist in this sort of a cycle of continued exploitation and continued marginalization, and uh, in the sense that being poor, you already don't have access to certain things. And then because you're poor, you're then denied access to other things that people don't feel comfortable giving to poor people, or help that they don't feel comfortable extending to poor people. Same thing, because you're black, you already have certain things that are being discriminated against you or held against you. That's not the case with the people we're talking about. We were just reading about white people, but uh, and so because you're black, you have these certain things that are held against you, or there's certain vulnerability, there's certain marginalization that exists. But then also that comes just inherently from you being black in this society. You have those things. But then there are also other things that are not necessarily being held from you because you're black. Uh damn. I'm not getting this off the right way. Okay, one second. So, what stands out to me the most from what we just read is just seeing another form of discrimination, or another form of marginalization happening, and seeing it being articulated by Matthew Desmond in the book. We've seen up to this point the difficulty that women who have children have had with finding housing, with keeping housing, with not only being worried about housing for themselves, but having to be worried about housing for their children. Not only being worried about food for themselves, heat for themselves, but those same things for their children. And so just that adds another layer of vulnerability, another layer of marginalization onto their experience. And I think that the last portion we read in that chapter did a very good job of giving some historical context to that experience, and speaking about how in the 50s and the 60s it was difficult for women to locate housing when they had children, and some of the experiences that they would have have to go through because they did have children, whether it be being evicted because their children were there, whether it be being denied access to homes because their children was there, or their children being kicked out. And so I think that that layer is very important. I think that each one of these chapters have sort of given us a vantage point to unique a unique aspect to the issue of housing that exists within here. And this chapter sort of gave us a look into the aspect of what it's like trying to find housing, or what it's like to be evicted with children and then be trying to find housing with children. We've seen multiple times before. Just earlier, one of the mothers lied about how many children she had in an effort to try to secure housing. And then you could end up being penalized for that. You know, so many things that we read about in here are tenants who are in such drastic, desperate situations, or people who are in such drastic, desperate situations, that they may do things that will be beneficial in the short run that will have a detrimental effect on them in the long run. And and you know, lying about how many children you have is one of those things, because if at any point the landlord finds out, you can be subject to eviction because of that, or you can be subject to some type of penalty because of that, or you risk being subject to some type of penalty because of that. And then I think the other thing we've seen here is one of the regular occurrences of the poor white people in this story has been when their frustration and anger is built up, uh, using racist language, or using prejudicial language, bigoted language towards black people. Even just the mind state that they have of not wanting to live near the Mexicans, or not wanting to live near the blacks, even though they are in just as dire of a situation of poverty as the black people are, or as some of the Mexicans may be. And again, we just see how regularly we are divided, even within the same type of classes, and even within the same type of experience, how how race divides class, how race is divided within class division, and then how class division exists within race division. And so these white people feel like they can't go to their family members who are of a different class than they are, and so they feel divided from them. But then they also don't want to go have to have any experiences with the black people who are in the same class as they are because they're of a separate race. And so you see that division that exists within there. And it is important to be able to articulate to people, and there's some people who are too far gone. There's some generations of people where you will not be able to get these type of bigoted, prejudicial mind ideologies out of their mind. But it's important for us for the people who we can still reach across the aisle to, and to be able to explain to them how we have more in common than we have separating us, and how so many of our experiences when it comes to experiences of poor people, working class people in this society, are perpetuated because we're divided along the race line. So let's continue reading. I think we're going to try to knock out a few more pages in this chapter. We might not finish this chapter all the way. Might have to do that on the next episode. Quote, "How old is the child?" End quote. The landlord asked. Quote, "6." End quote. Quote, "Call back next month." End quote. Arlene hung up. She had called on or applied for 82 apartments. She had been accepted to none. Even in the inner city, most were out of her reach. And the landlords of the places she could afford if she handed over everything weren't calling back. Arlene started again, dialing 3 more numbers. Too expensive. Automated message. Quote, "Call back Monday." End quote. Arlene was exhausted from rushing to the hospital the night before. She had run out of prednisone, and Jafar's had an asthma attack. It was hard for Arlene to stay on top of his asthma with so many other things to worry about. Once she ended a long and fruitless day of apartment hunting with the awful realization that she had left a backpack with Jafar's breathing equipment at a bus stop. After a day without treatment, Jafar seemed fine. But 2 days later, he woke up and told Arlene, quote, "Mommy, I don't feel good." End quote. She heard him wheezing and called an ambulance. That time, they had transferred him to Children's Hospital near the zoo and kept him overnight. This time, they were able to make it back to the shelter by 10:30 p.m., and the on-call social worker was nice enough to pay for a cab to and from the hospital. When number 85 answered the phone, Arlene replied, quote, "Hi, how you doing?" End quote, instead of, quote, "Hi, how you doing?" End quote, or, quote, "Hi, I'm calling about your property." End quote. She had been trying different pitches and bending her voice in different directions. She would tell one landlord one thing and another something else. Sometimes she was in the shelter, sometimes she wasn't. Sometimes she had 2 children, sometimes 1. Sometimes they were in child care, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes she received child support, sometimes she didn't. She was grasping, experimenting, trying out alter stories at random. Arlene wouldn't know how to game the system if she wanted to. Quote, "Is there a man in the picture?" End quote, number 85 asked. Quote, "There won't be no man." End quote. Quote, "Are you going to have men coming over once in a while?" End quote. Quote, "No, it's just me and my son." End quote. Quote, "How old is your son?" End quote. Number 86 had wanted $825 a month plus another additional $25 for jewelry. But number 88 had left her with a good feeling. Number 88 was a large 3-story brick building at the end of a dead-end road on Milwaukee's north side. Quote, "I think that one time it was an institution," end quote, the building manager told Arlene. Quote, "Could have been an old people's house or something," end quote. Mental ward, Arlene guessed. Inside was clean and quiet. The walls were not off-white or beige, but hospital white. Rich people's teeth white. Dark wood doors with brass numbers open into long and low-ceilinged hallways. Arlene and the boys followed the building manager and listened to the squeaks of their shoes. Behind the manager's back, Jory lunged at Jafaris, making him jump, and the boys let out a muffled laugh, which helped shake away the creeps. Quote, "My name is Ali," end quote, the building manager said. Quote, "It means of noble descent," end quote. A straight backed black man with a brown kufi. Ali wore beige pants and a matching beige shirt, buttoned to the top. He showed Arlene into the first unit. Quote, I got one or two problem tenants, end quote, he said. Quote, but that's it. It's just that some people, they can't get with that Huxtable culture. They're more South Central in that culture. And I don't like that culture, end quote. Arlene looked around the apartment, which was decorated with sparse furniture that probably predated the Cosby Show. Quote, you know, end quote, Ali continued, quote, doing life like you're supposed to be doing, paying your bills, end quote. He was clearing his throat and speaking stronger now. Quote, in a committed relationship. That's a big one right there. I be on black women, you know, not having no committed relationships and be Miss Independent. Let's bring back family. If you ain't trying to be about family, then I don't care about sister here. Then I don't care about sister here and helping you in any sort of way. I'm about family, about what's right and good, end quote. Arlene had been smiling at Ali, and he just noticed. He was funny. Quote, you like this one or you want to see another one, end quote. Quote, doesn't even matter. I just need a place, end quote. The rent was $500 for a one-bedroom. The light bill would be in Arlene's name. On the application, next to, quote, previous landlord, end quote, Arlene wrote, quote, Sharina Tarver, end quote. Next to reasons for moving, she decided on, quote, slumlord, end quote. Arlene hesitated, then went ahead and asked if cats were allowed. Quote, they say no pets, but I myself, I do like cats. Can't stand dogs, so I might be willing to negotiate on that, end quote. Quote, well, I'd appreciate it. And we, end quote, Arlene looked at Jory. She was mostly doing this for him. He understood that, and it showed in his big brown eyes. Quote, don't cry, Jory, because you're about to make me cry, end quote. Jory quickly turned away and walked to the window. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. Give me 1 second. Okay, let's keep reading a little bit longer. We'll knock out another like page and a half, and then we'll wrap this episode up. Arlene decided to stop to see her cousin, JP. She adored JP with his wide face and easy demeanor. Quote, let's see if his landlord have anything, end quote, she said. Ali was nice, but he wasn't the one who approved applications. Arlene also wanted to check in on her son, Boosie, who had been sleeping at JP's place on 26th Street in Chambers, which might have been the exact middle of the ghetto. Not long after Larry walked out, Child Protective Services removed Gerger, Boosie, and Arlene's 3 other children from her care. Quote, I just gave up responsibility, end quote, Arlene remembered. Quote, that really, really hurted me when he did that. I wish I was stronger, end quote. In the years that followed, Arlene's children grew up in and out of foster care. Quote, but Boosie never wanted to come back home, end quote, Arlene said. She remembered Boosie calling CPS when he was 15, telling a caseworker that the children had been left alone. Quote, so they came to take my kids again, end quote. She had Jafaris by then. He was 2 at the time, and Jory was 10. Both boys would later rejoin Arlene, but Boosie and Arlene's other 2 children from Larry remained in the system. Arlene didn't know why. She did know that their foster families had more money than she did. They could buy her children new clothes, feed them every night, and provide them with their own beds to sleep in. But unlike his younger brother and sister, Boosie didn't stay in the system for long. When he was 17, he left his foster family, dropped out of high school, and started selling crack. A dark stairwell opened into the bright apartment. The house was warm and smelled of eggs and sausage. Boosie was on the couch, skinny with a backwards cap. After noticing Arlene and the boys, he grabbed a pellet gun made to look like a .45 and charged toward Jafaris. Boosie stuck the gun in Jafaris' back and tackled him onto a mattress in an adjoining room, causing someone's copy of Bastard Out of California, folded down to keep a place, to flop on the floor. Jafaris wiggled and laughed, but couldn't escape. Quote, man, have you ever seen a 6-year-old more gangster? End quote. Boosie laughed, releasing Jafaris and handing him the gun. Jafar smiled and inspected the piece. Quote, all right, little nigga, give me back my gun, end quote. Arlene shook her head, and Boosie nodded back at his mother. Arlene asked JP to call his landlord, and he did. The landlord said that the downstairs unit was available. Before leaving, Arlene made an appointment to see it the next day. Quote, Boosie bogus, end quote, she vented to Jory when they got outside. Quote, as skinny as he is, he either tweaking or they ain't feeding him, end quote. Her face was heavy with the mother's concern. She shook it off. Quote, I can't worry about that now, end quote. Quote, you gonna take it? End quote, Jory asked, hopeful. Arlene considered the lower unit. Quote, I don't know. There's too much drama over there, end quote, she said, thinking about the cops and the drugs. Arlene pushed on, staying on the north side. She passed the simple blue house where her mother had died and the apartments on Atkinson she called, quote, Crackhead City, end quote. She stopped by her old condemned house on 19th and Hampton, squat, quiet, and still half painted. On the front door, a sign was posted, this building is illegally occupied or unfit for human habitation and shall be vacated. Quote, God, I miss living at this house, end quote, Arlene said. Jafaris volunteered to check the mail, and Arlene smiled at him. Quote, we ain't got no mail, boo, end quote. What forced her to finally call the city was not the water problem. When it didn't work, they made do, fetching gallons from a nearby store. But when the landlord finally came over with his toolbox, he sawed holes all over the bathroom walls and did something to the pipes that caused the water to leak in. When Arlene called to complain, she remembered him saying, quote, well, I've got over 50 properties. If you can't wait, move, end quote. That's when Arlene called the building inspector. Quote, stupid of me, end quote. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme once again within this chapter. And then that's going to bring us to a changing of the storyline that we're with as well. So that will bring us to a close with Arlene in this chapter. And what stands out to me from the passage we just read is just, again, how difficult it is for tenants to, especially inner city tenants, especially inner city black tenants, to be able to, or inner city tenants of color, to be able to get the things they need for their housing, to get things fixed, to get the housing to be brought up to a livable quality. It's difficult for them to do that because they don't have the power or the leverage to force these landlords into doing these things. They're usually just scraping by on rent. When it's time for them to, when they have maybe some of their most leverage, when it's time for them to get ready to move in, when a landlord is trying to get somebody into a spot, they're so desperate to get in that they are willing to accept things as is. They usually are not just desperate to get in because they want to have their own place, but they're desperate to get in because they don't have other places to go, which means, again, they're trying to move in as soon as possible, which makes the landlords know that they're desperate. And so the landlords feel less of a need to fix things up. And then by the time they get in there, they've sort of lost some leverage and some power. And then as time goes on and they're trying to get certain things fixed, the landlords become negligent, as we just heard about Arlene speaking about. And then once the landlords become negligent, they have such limited options available to them to try to force the landlord to not be negligent. When they try to withhold rent, they can be penalized for that. When they try to call the city to get certain things fixed, they can be penalized for that. They can't afford to pay somebody who is not the landlord to come and fix these things. So that's not really an option for them. And so all of these things, just especially as we've gotten so deep into this book, it just illustrates the drastic circumstances that people are in when it comes to housing. And again, I think one of the things I want to make sure I'm emphasizing is that even though we're taking a very isolated look of the experience of certain people in Milwaukee, it's important to know that this experience is duplicated, even if it's in its own unique ways, all over the country on an everyday basis. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We will be back tomorrow to continue reading Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide you the opportunity to begin or further your journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. We'll holler at you tomorrow.